no one knows what Gene Hackman did during those 7 days. No one saw, no one heard, no one cared, until it was too late. 7 days in that house, just him, 3 dogs, and a wife who was no longer living. Did he realize it? Did he talk to her as if she was still there? Or did Alzheimer's plunge him into a distorted reality where past and present blurred together? Did he care for her in some way, or did he spend those 7 days in a daze, not understanding that his life had forever changed? Only one thing is certain: when Hackman collapsed at his doorstep, he didn't just lose his wife. He lost everything. Every story has its beginning, but when no one knows what really happened, that beginning is just a void. Hollywood has had hundreds of thousands of thrilling stories about fading stars, but none like Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa. They lived a quiet life in the American West, far from the clamor of the spotlight. But in the end, that quietness became the most terrifying thing. Since leaving Hollywood in the early 2000s, Hackman and Arakawa had chosen Santa Fe as their sanctuary. A peaceful town with dusty roads stretching across desolate deserts, where nothing but mountain ranges, clear skies, and eerie silence surrounded them. For them, it was freedom. Hackman, once one of the world's greatest actors, completely shed his illustrious past. No interviews, no appearances. No one knew exactly how he was living. Arakawa, once a pianist with bright musical dreams, embraced a secluded life after marrying Hackman, avoiding Hollywood altogether. They chose to disappear, and it seemed the world had forgotten them, too. On February 11th, Betsy Arakawa left home to go shopping. It was the last time she was seen in public. Nothing unusual happened that morning, a day like any other. She bought some groceries, chatted with the cashier at the local supermarket, then drove home. There were no signs of anxiety or panic. No one knew that in just a few hours, everything would change forever. The strange thing was that after February 11th, no one heard any news about her. Neighbors didn't see her, no one received messages or calls from her, and, most importantly, no one asked questions. People living near Hackman's house sometimes saw him walking on his vast land, a solitary old man, 95 years old, quietly wandering amidst nature, shunning people. But even that stopped after February 11th. No one saw Hackman anymore. His and Betsy's house was shrouded in darkness. There were no signs of life, but no one thought anything was amiss. In Santa Fe, silence is not unusual. People are used to isolation, everyone has their own life, and no one interferes in others' affairs. But this time, the silence was not just a choice. It was a warning that no one recognized. When someone disappears, who will be the first to notice? Family? Friends? Neighbors? But Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa had no close people by their side. They had no children, no help, no one who visited regularly. And so, no one asked questions. No calls were made. No one visited their house. No missing person reports. Everything continued as normal, as if they had never existed. Until the truth was revealed. From February 11th to February 18th, what happened inside that house? A woman disappeared. An elderly man with Alzheimer's remained. But did he realize the emptiness? Hackman was probably not lucid enough to understand what was happening. Perhaps he still thought Betsy had just gone out for a moment and would return soon. But time passed. Day after day, the silence lingered. And what's more frightening, what did Gene Hackman do during those days? No matter how great a movie star he was, no matter how much the world once hailed him, the final price was loneliness. Gene Hackman spent his life playing heroes, strong characters who never gave up. But at this moment, in that dark house, he was alone. She didn't return. No one knocked on the door. There was no explanation. And that silence gradually became haunting. When memories fall away like the last leaves of autumn, does one still recognize the boundary between reality and the past? Gene Hackman was once one of Hollywood's greatest actors, a man who could immerse the world in the characters he brought to life. But in a small house in the desolate lands of Santa Fe, he was no longer a silver screen legend. He was just an old man, alone, trapped between reality and the fading fragments of his memories. On February 11th, Betsy Arakawa vanished from his life. No one knew exactly what had happened. But when the police discovered her remains, a far more haunting question arose: what had Gene Hackman been doing during those 7 days? Their home, already quiet, had become suffocating. A space filled with unanswered mysteries. A house of shadows. A house of isolation. She lay there, in the very home they once shared. 3 dogs roamed the yard, perhaps waiting for something that would never come. And Gene Hackman, where was he? What had he done? They say Alzheimer's doesn't just take away memories, it steals time, space, and even emotion. A single day can stretch endlessly or vanish in an instant. Did Hackman realize his wife was gone, or in his mind, was she still there just as always? In the late stages of Alzheimer's, even the most familiar faces become unrecognizable. Even if Betsy was right before his eyes, did Hackman truly see the woman he had spent more than 30 years with? Or had he stepped into an entirely different world, one where loss no longer had meaning? Did he call her name? Did he try to wake her? Or, in his fading mind, did he simply think she was asleep? No one knows the answers. But what is known is that for 7 days, Gene Hackman remained in that house, never once calling, never once seeking help. Absolute isolation. A silence that chills the soul. When the police entered, they found no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no missed emergency calls. Everything was eerily still. That small house had once been a sanctuary for 2 people who had chosen to leave the world behind. Now, it was an empty shell. Sunlight still filtered through the windows, but no one remained to bask in it. On the cold wooden floor, a cane belonging to Hackman lay near the door. Had he tried to step outside but lacked the strength? Did he realize he was alone in that house, or was he simply waiting for another ordinary morning, one where Betsy would make coffee and play the piano as she always did? No one knows, and perhaps neither did Hackman himself. The police found 3 dogs on the property. One of them had passed away, perhaps from illness or starvation. The remaining 2 had survived, but they could not speak. They had witnessed everything, yet no one could ever understand what they had seen. Betsy Arakawa had loved animals, and those 2 surviving dogs had likely wandered the house, searching for the familiar hand that once stroked their fur, for the gentle voice that once called their names. But all they found was silence, a silence so deep, so suffocating, it felt alive. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of it all was not what had happened inside that house, but the fact that for 7 whole days, no one knew. No one called. No one knocked. No one realized that Gene Hackman, the man once admired by the world, was now just an old man lost within his own home. A house of shadows. A house of forgetting. And inside, Gene Hackman may have spent his final days never knowing that the world had left him behind long ago. 7 days in the abyss. What is time to a mind lost in oblivion? 7 days could be an eternity, or they could pass in the blink of an eye, leaving no trace behind. Within that house, Gene Hackman spent 7 days in complete isolation. No phone calls came. No one knocked on the door. No one knew that inside that quiet little house, a heartbreaking story was slowly unfolding. When the police entered on February 18th, they found everything exactly as it had been on February 11th. No sign of disturbance. No evidence of a struggle. No cry for help ever sent. But inside that house, time had stopped. A glass of water sat untouched on the table, coated in dust. An open book, left where Betsy had last been reading, rested on the sofa. A phone, neatly placed on the table, held no record of incoming or outgoing calls. And on the bed where Betsy Arakawa had lain down on February 11th, there were signs that Hackman had been there beside her. Did he know? Or was he just waiting for someone? In the final stages of Alzheimer's, the very concept of loss may no longer exist. Did Hackman understand that Betsy was gone, or in his reality, was she simply asleep, still there, as always? There were signs that he may have interacted with her remains. Her medication was found near the bed, as if someone had tried to help her take it. A blanket was carefully draped over her, neat and undisturbed. A glass of water sat on the nightstand beside her, though no one knew how long it had been there. Gene Hackman may not have realized that Betsy would never wake up again. Perhaps he sat beside her each day, whispering to her, waiting for an answer that never came. Or perhaps Alzheimer's had taken everything from him, his awareness, his memories, even his grief. Beyond Betsy's room, the police found something chilling, a small dog, lifeless inside a closet. Why was it there? Had it wandered in and become trapped, or had someone placed it there? Did Hackman understand what had happened? No one knows. But what is certain is that he had spent 7 days alone, surrounded by mysteries no one could ever unravel. In one corner of the house, Hackman's cane was found near the door. It seemed as though he had tried to leave but lacked the strength. 7 days, to an ordinary person, that is enough time to feel every passing second, to count every moment in excruciating clarity. But to Hackman, those 7 days may have been nothing but an endless loop, a blurred existence where he drifted from room to room, searching for something he no longer remembered. When the police found him, he was gone. No one knew what he had endured. In those 7 days, no one knew what had truly happened inside that house. Only the silent objects bore witness, a cup of tea long gone cold, newspapers untouched and unread. 3 dogs, 1 lost, 2 surviving, their eyes filled with a confusion beyond human understanding. How had those 7 days passed? No one knows, and perhaps no one ever will. In the house steeped in silence, there were only 3 witnesses to the tragedy, the dogs. One of them was gone, the other 2 wandered the house, waiting for something that would never happen. Creatures most loyal to humans, yet unable to utter a single explanation. When the police entered Gene Hackman's house, they noticed a heavy silence pervading everything. But amidst that silence, 2 pairs of eyes watched them, 2 surviving dogs, gaunt and bewildered. They were alive but not like ordinary dogs. No rushing to greet strangers, no barking, no vigorous reactions. Just standing there, eyes filled with unspoken things. But the most disturbing thing was the 3rd dog. It was dead, not in the living room, not on the bed, but inside a closet. An unexpected place. Why was it there? The biggest question. That stopped the police. Did this dog crawl into the closet and get trapped, or did someone put it there? Did it perish from starvation, or was there another cause? Did Gene Hackman know anything about this? If Hackman were still lucid, he would never let a dog be trapped to the point of no escape. But if Alzheimer's had taken his clarity, could he have inadvertently locked it in without remembering? Or did something else happen in those 7 days? The police quickly conducted an examination of the deceased dog. They wanted to find the cause, to know if it had passed away from exhaustion or something else. The results raised more questions than answers. No signs of external injury, no signs of prolonged starvation. But there were traces of a neurological reaction, as if it had experienced a major shock. A dog cannot close a closet door on its own. If it was locked in, why didn't Hackman find it for a week? The 2 surviving dogs had the answers, but they couldn't speak. What had transpired in that house? They might have roamed through every room, seeing everything. They might have witnessed Hackman sitting beside his wife's body, or perhaps seen him no longer recognize that she was gone. These dogs were there. They saw, they heard. They might be the only remaining witnesses. But all they could do was look at humans with eyes filled with inexpressible things. And thus, the mystery of that house remained intact. A 95-year-old man collapsed right in front of his house, next to the walking stick he had relied on in his final years. But what happened in that moment? Was this the moment Gene Hackman realized the full truth? A delivery person arrived at Hackman's house. He knocked. No one answered. Looking through the window, he saw something strange, a figure lying motionless near the entrance. The police arrived shortly after. The door opened, revealing Gene Hackman collapsed on the floor, as if he had tried to get up but couldn't. And what shocked everyone, beside him, his familiar walking stick was still there. But no one knew what he had tried to do before collapsing. Was this Gene Hackman's final moment of awareness? Gene Hackman had lived in that house for a week, isolated, without contacting anyone. No one knew how he had spent those days. Did he know Betsy Arakawa was gone? Did he notice the silence of the house, the absence of his partner? Did he sense something was wrong? A person with Alzheimer's can forget memories, forget familiar faces. But the feeling of loneliness may remain. In the past few days, he might have wandered around that house, unconsciously searching for a voice he no longer heard. And then, in that fateful moment, did Gene Hackman realize the truth? Gene Hackman's walking stick was not in a corner or leaning against a table. It was right beside him, as if he had held it for the last time. Did he try to get up? Did he try to open the door, to go outside? Or did he fall the moment he realized the bitter truth? Whatever the reason, all signs indicated Hackman had not left the house for those 7 days. No calls, no messages, no visitors. A Hollywood legend who once stood before millions of viewers was now left alone in a silent house. A natural passing, but was it a solitary passing? The forensic report concluded Gene Hackman passed away from natural causes. His heart had stopped beating, perhaps due to age, perhaps due to the disease that had gradually taken his life. But the saddest truth was that he had spent his final days completely alone. No one knew what he was thinking. No one knew if he understood what had happened. No one knew if the moment he collapsed was the moment everything became clear to him. That house, once chosen by the couple to enjoy their old age, now became a testament to the tragedy of isolation. Gene Hackman had lived a glorious life, full of light and applause. But when the curtain fell, he fell into a silence that no one could break. Terrifying silence. No one by his side. No one knew what happened in those final days. The moment Hackman fell, was that the moment he realized everything? Or did he leave without ever knowing the truth? No one has the answer, and perhaps there never will be. 1 day passed. Then 2 days. A week went by. No one called. No one visited. No one wondered what Gene Hackman was doing in that house. The world was busy with its own rhythm. New movies were released. Awards continued to be given. Young actors rose. Hollywood forgot Gene Hackman. The man who once stirred the screen with legendary roles had retreated into seclusion for 2 decades. And in the moment he needed someone the most, no one was there. The most haunting question is why? Why didn't anyone call him? Why didn't the neighbors notice anything unusual? Why didn't friends and family reach out to him sooner? Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa lived a quiet life, avoiding all eyes. They didn't appear in public often. They didn't update social media. But this level of isolation, so deep that no one discovered what had happened until 7 days later, was shocking. When news of Hackman spread, the film world was shaken. Hollywood was stunned. People recalled his films, his Oscar statuettes, his history-making roles. Fans everywhere expressed their condolences. But perhaps no one was more shocked than Gene Hackman himself. If he had truly been aware of what was happening, if at some moment Alzheimer's no longer clouded his mind, if at some moment he realized Betsy was gone, if in his final moment he understood he was completely alone. Just thinking about it is enough to make everyone choke up. Gene Hackman's life was a cinematic story. From a young man struggling to rise in Hollywood to a legendary star, he once stood at the pinnacle of glory. But the ending of this story wasn't like a Hollywood movie. No farewell. No one by his side. The final chapter of his life closed in a silent house in the New Mexico desert. The place that was once a peaceful haven for the couple had become a testament to loneliness. An unexpected tragedy, but also a warning. A warning about isolation. About the final years of life. About how a legend can be forgotten when the spotlight fades. After everything came to light, many in the film industry began to ask questions. Former co-stars, directors who had worked with Hackman, all were stunned. Some said, "We should have checked in on him." But by then, all regrets were too late. Hackman was one of the finest actors of the 20th century. Yet in his final years, he had no one by his side. No nostalgic gatherings. No one to ask about his day. The world only truly paid attention to Gene Hackman after he was gone. Gene Hackman's tragedy is not just one person's story. It is a story about isolation. About people who were once great but then forgotten. How many more legends will have such an ending? How many elderly people will spend their final days unknown? Hackman's story is not just an ending. It is a reminder about fathers, mothers, grandfathers, grandmothers. About those who were once the light of the world but then sank into solitary darkness. Gene Hackman lived an incredible life. His final chapter should not have ended like this. When the door of the house was opened, the police stepped inside, facing a scene both haunting and perplexing. Gene Hackman lay collapsed just inside the entrance, beside his familiar walking stick. It was known that he had lived in this house for 7 days, alone with the body of his wife, Betsy Arakawa. But the most crucial question remained unanswered. What had Hackman done during those 7 days? No calls were made. No messages were sent. No one visited. Hackman, one of Hollywood's greatest icons, had spent his final days in complete solitude, beside the woman who had been his partner for over 30 years. But what sent chills down everyone's spine was how he faced that reality. When the police found Betsy's body, it was still on the bed, as if she had just fallen asleep. There were no signs of violence. No disturbance. No traces indicating Hackman had tried to call for help or leave the house. This led to an even more terrifying hypothesis. Had he failed to realize his wife was gone? Hackman suffered from Alzheimer's, it was a well-known fact. But no one expected the disease to plunge him into such a dreadful situation. According to medical records, his memory had deteriorated significantly in recent years. He forgot the names of acquaintances. Forgot the films he had starred in. And gradually, he forgot himself. But to forget such an obvious truth, that Betsy had passed away right beside him, was something no one could have imagined. Was it possible that for those 7 days, Hackman continued to live as if his wife were still alive? He might have cooked, setting aside a portion for her out of habit. He might have talked to Betsy, believing she was still listening. Hackman might have been completely unaware that she was no longer responding. People with late-stage Alzheimer's often fall into memory loops. They reenact familiar habits and actions even when reality has changed. Hackman might have gone into the bedroom every night, seen Betsy lying there, and thought she was still asleep. He might have told himself, "Betsy is tired, I shouldn't disturb her," and then, day after day, he continued to live like that, unaware that reality had shifted. However, when the police examined the house, they discovered some unusual details. Betsy's body showed no signs of severe decomposition, a strange thing after 7 days. It appeared to have been preserved in some way. The blanket on the bed was still neatly arranged, as if someone had been repeatedly pulling it up to cover her. There were traces of moisture on the pillow. A coincidence? Or had Hackman cried unconsciously? An even more unsettling hypothesis was raised. Had Hackman been trying to care for his wife's body without realizing she was gone? If his memory hadn't completely vanished, perhaps, in a fleeting moment, Hackman had realized the truth. Perhaps he had tried to shake her awake, perhaps he had called her name in panic. And when there was no response, he had fallen into utter confusion. But instead of calling emergency services, instead of seeking help, he might have retreated from reality. Alzheimer's not only makes people forget but also makes them lost in their own perceptions. Hackman might have believed that if he continued to live as normal, Betsy would wake up tomorrow. And so, he continued to wait. But there was another mystery. Why had one of Hackman's 3 dogs died inside the closet? The police found it locked inside, with no signs of injury or prolonged starvation. But the strange thing was, a dog cannot close a closet door on its own. There were 2 possibilities. 1. Hackman had inadvertently locked it in during a moment of memory lapse. He might have thought it was running away. He might have mistaken it for something else. 2. The dog had run inside to hide because it had witnessed something too horrifying. Dogs have a keen sense of death. They can smell the changes in a human's body before they pass away. They can react strongly to things they don't understand. Had this dog been frightened by the prolonged silence in the house? Had it tried to escape something only it had seen? And then it got trapped, and never got out. 7 days passed in a loop of forgetfulness. But then, at some point, Hackman stepped out of that state. It could have been a vague memory flashing. It could have been a final glimmer of clarity in his mind. As he looked back, he realized, Betsy would never wake up again. It was in that moment that he collapsed. His walking stick was not in a corner. It was right beside him, as if he had tried to stand up, tried to step out of that house, but couldn't. Hackman had lived a great life, but his final days were shrouded in a terrifying silence. Alone in the house that was once filled with laughter. Alone, facing the truth, which he might no longer have been lucid enough to fully comprehend. When the police removed Hackman's body from the house, they couldn't know if, in his final moments, he had truly realized everything. 7 days. A man, a body, 3 dogs, and a terrifying silence. No one knows how Gene Hackman spent those 7 days. No one knows what he was thinking. The remaining mysteries in that house may never be solved. But the most frightening question is, if Hackman hadn't collapsed, would anyone have ever discovered him?